The stage was set, the lights beaming down on the polished desk as the audience buzzed with anticipation. The night's guest was a legend, someone whose name carried decades of respect, admiration, and a sense of unshakable confidence. The host, a master of late-night television, thrived on poking fun at his guests, testing their humor and ability to roll with the punches. It was his signature style, sometimes playful, sometimes cutting, but always designed to put the spotlight firmly on himself. As the conversation began, the host's smirk widened, his usual cue that he was about to set up a joke at his guests' expense. He leaned back, playing to the audience, his tone dripping with the casual arrogance that had become a staple of his show. The crowd chuckled preemptively, conditioned to expect a punchline at any moment. He started reminiscing, feigning nostalgia, as he recalled the golden age of action films, the era where his guest had reigned supreme. But then, the shift came. His words took on a sharper edge, laced with just enough mockery to blur the line between friendly banter and something more condescending. He painted a picture of the past, exaggerating the tropes, the over-the-top sequences, the larger-than-life persona that had captivated millions. His tone suggested that this era, though beloved, was now something to be laughed at, outdated, out of touch. The audience, trained to follow his lead, let out a ripple of laughter. It was a well-practiced rhythm, the kind of moment he had perfected over the years. He knew exactly how to phrase his jokes to keep things just light enough that the guest couldn't outright object without seeming defensive. It was the subtlety that made it effective, the kind of humor that allowed him to appear as if he was merely having fun, while ensuring that the joke always landed at someone else's expense. The remark that followed was the real test. With a carefully crafted smirk, he referenced how times had changed, how the industry had evolved, subtly implying that his guest was a relic of a bygone era. He brought up younger stars, new action heroes, and the shift toward a different kind of storytelling. The message was clear. The guest sitting across from him was no longer the face of action, no longer at the center of the cultural zeitgeist. It was a move designed to get a reaction, to see how much of it would be laughed off and how much would be met with resistance. The crowd's reaction told him he had struck the intended chord. Some chuckled awkwardly, some laughed outright, and some waited for the guest's response. It was the moment he thrived on, the carefully orchestrated dance where he maintained control of the conversation, leading it exactly where he wanted it to go. He had done this countless times before, watching as guests either played along, laughing at themselves, or stumbled over their words, unsure of how to counter his playful jabs. But there was something different about this moment, something in the way the guest sat back, taking in the comment with a level of patience that seemed almost calculated. It wasn't the reaction the host was expecting. There was no nervous chuckle, no forced humility, no desperate attempt to prove relevance. Instead, there was a knowing look, a silent confidence that suggested the host may have miscalculated this particular exchange. The moment lingered for just a second longer than usual. It was an invisible shift, a barely perceptible change in the energy of the room. The audience, still expecting the usual rhythm of the show, began to sense that this might not play out the way it typically did. The host, always quick on his feet, started to prepare his next line, ready to redirect the conversation if necessary. But then, before he could steer things back in his favor, the guest spoke. The words weren't defensive, they weren't aggressive, but they carried an unmistakable weight. It wasn't just a response, it was a challenge wrapped in humor, a counterpunch delivered with effortless charm. The host's smirk wavered, just for a fraction of a second, as he realized that the conversation had just taken a turn he hadn't planned for. The air in the studio shifted the moment the guest leaned forward, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled something was coming. The host, still basking in the laughter from his previous remark, had expected a polite chuckle, maybe a self-deprecating quip to keep the conversation moving. That was how these moments typically played out, but instead of conceding to the joke, the guest let the silence stretch just a second too long, just long enough to make the host slightly uneasy. Then, with a measured tone and a glint of amusement in his eyes, the guest spoke. The words were casual, almost too casual, as if brushing off a speck of dust rather than addressing an insult wrapped in humor. But there was something in the way they were delivered. Smooth, confident, effortless. It was the kind of response that carried weight, not because it was aggressive or defensive, but because it didn't need to be. The host had set up the joke expecting an easy win, but what came next was a reversal so perfectly timed it felt like a scene from a well-crafted script. With a quick remark, the guest dismantled the premise entirely, turning the joke back around in a way that was both hilarious and undeniable. The delivery was impeccable. Not forced, not over the top, just sharp enough to cut through the host's carefully controlled narrative. Laughter erupted from the audience, but this time it wasn't just polite amusement. It was loud, unexpected, the kind of genuine reaction that couldn't be manufactured, the kind that indicated something special had just happened. The host, ever the professional, tried to maintain his composure, but there was no denying the slight flicker of surprise in his expression. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Realizing he had just lost control of the moment, the host attempted to pivot, to regain his footing with another quip. But the guest was already ahead of him, seamlessly weaving in another remark that doubled down on the first, making it clear that this wasn't a fluke. The guest wasn't just playing along, he was in complete control now. The audience, sensing the shift, roared with laughter again, fully engaged in the unexpected turn of events. It wasn't just about humor. It was about presence. The guest didn't need to raise his voice or resort to exaggerated theatrics. He didn't need to explain why the joke had failed or why the premise had been flawed. Instead, he let his words do the work, exposing the underlying absurdity of the host's setup without breaking a sweat. The best part? It wasn't mean-spirited. There was no bitterness, no malice, just a masterful use of timing, wit, and confidence. It was the kind of humor that didn't rely on tearing others down, but instead elevated the conversation to a different level entirely. And in doing so, the guest had turned the tables in a way that left no room for a comeback. For a brief moment, the host hesitated, searching for a way to salvage the exchange, but the damage had already been done. The power dynamic had shifted, and there was no taking it back. The audience wasn't laughing at the guest, they were laughing with him. And more importantly, they were laughing at the situation that had just unfolded, one where the usual formula had been completely dismantled. The guest, sensing victory, but never one to overplay his hand, simply leaned back, letting the moment breathe. There was no need to rub it in. The point had been made, the message delivered loud and clear without a single moment of over-explanation. And just like that, the conversation moved on, but not before everyone in the room realized they had just witnessed something that would be talked about long after the cameras stopped rolling. The audience had been primed for a certain kind of moment, the kind they had seen play out countless times before. A guest walks in, takes a seat, engages in playful banter, and at some point, the host delivers a well-placed joke at their expense. The guest in turn either laughs along or fumbles through an awkward response, reinforcing the idea that this was the host's domain, his stage, his playground. It was a formula that had worked flawlessly, until now. The laughter that erupted this time wasn't the expected kind. It wasn't the usual chuckle of agreement that followed the host's clever jabs. It was different, louder, more genuine, carrying an unmistakable shift in energy. It was the kind of reaction that didn't just fill the room, but took on a life of its own, spreading like wildfire. The host, who had always prided himself on being the quickest in the room, felt the weight of that laughter in real time. It was no longer his to control. It wasn't at his joke, at his setup, or at his planned punchline. It was at what had just unfolded before them, a perfectly executed reversal that left no room for recovery. The guest sat back, his expression calm, as if he had barely exerted any effort at all. He wasn't gloating, wasn't pushing for more, just letting the moment exist exactly as it was. That, more than anything, was what made it so devastatingly effective. The host instinctively tried to salvage the moment. He leaned forward slightly, searching for a way to shift the attention back, but the audience wasn't done. They were still reveling in what had just happened, still feeding off the unexpected brilliance of it all. The sound of their reaction filled the studio, drowning out any attempt to move past it too quickly. For the first time in a long time, the host was caught off guard in his own space. He was used to controlling the pace, dictating the rhythm of every exchange, knowing exactly when to press a joke and when to pull back. But now, for the first time, he was left without an immediate answer. His guest had just delivered something so perfectly timed, so effortlessly sharp, that it had taken the entire room a moment to process. The brilliance wasn't just in what was said, but in how it was said, with a smooth, unshaken confidence that couldn't be taught, couldn't be rehearsed. It was the kind of natural charisma that couldn't be faked, and that was what made it so undeniably effective. The longer the audience laughed, the clearer it became that this moment wasn't going away anytime soon. It was going to live beyond this night, beyond this episode, beyond the carefully structured format of the show. The host finally let out a small chuckle, a forced attempt to regain some sense of control. But the moment had already passed him by. It wasn't his anymore. The balance had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. The moment the exchange hit the airwaves, it was as if a spark had been lit in dry brush. At first, it rippled through the live audience, a wave of laughter and surprise that couldn't be contained. But the true impact wasn't felt in the studio. It was what happened after, when the cameras kept rolling, and the clip began making its way beyond the walls of the late-night stage. The reaction started in real time. Viewers at home, some tuning in for their usual dose of entertainment, others simply catching the show out of habit, suddenly found themselves wide-eyed and leaning closer. Social media lit up within minutes. The first clips, ripped from TV screens, and phone cameras started appearing online before the show had even finished airing. The captioning varied. Some called it the funniest moment of the year, others described it as a verbal knockout. But they all agreed on one thing. No one had expected it to unfold this way. By the time the West Coast broadcast aired, the internet was already buzzing. Comments poured in by the thousands. People who had once admired the host's ability to steer conversations to his liking were now watching him struggle to regain his footing, and they couldn't get enough of it. Memes popped up almost instantly. The moment of hesitation, the slight stumble, the flicker of realization, it was all captured, looped, dissected, and spread like wildfire. The next morning, the headlines followed. News outlets, entertainment blogs, and culture commentators all jumped on the story. Some framed it as a rare moment of a guest outshining the host in his own domain. Others called it a shift in the power dynamic of late-night television. But the common theme in every article was the sheer unpredictability of it all. There was something refreshing about seeing someone turn the tables so effortlessly, not with anger or aggression, but with sheer confidence and wit. It reminded people of an era when conversations weren't so carefully curated, when humor was sharp but not mean-spirited, when intelligence didn't need to be shouted to be heard. And that's what made it so compelling. It wasn't forced. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was real. Celebrities chimed in. Some took to social media to applaud the guest's composure and sharp humor. Others, who had been on the receiving end of similar moments with the host before, laughed at the irony of it all. Even rival talk show hosts found ways to reference the moment in their own broadcasts, subtly acknowledging that something special had happened. The host, for his part, tried to lean into it. He addressed it in the following episode, making a few self-deprecating jokes about being caught off guard. But the truth was clear. This wasn't a moment he had orchestrated, and that was what made it stand out. Days passed, and yet the clip kept circulating. It was analyzed, remixed, and replayed, cementing itself as one of those rare television moments that transcend the usual cycle of late-night banter. It wasn't just another joke, another interview, another episode. It was a reminder that authenticity, humor, and intelligence still had the power to surprise, even in a setting where everything was designed to be predictable. As the dust settled, and the moment continued to reverberate across television screens and social media platforms, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another fleeting viral clip. It had left an impression, one that couldn't be undone, by a quick segment the following night, or a carefully worded follow-up tweet. The brilliance of it all was in the simplicity. No dramatic outbursts, no unnecessary theatrics, just pure, effortless wit delivered with precision. It reminded audiences that true confidence doesn't need to be forced, and intelligence doesn't need to be loud. It was a moment that people didn't just watch, they felt it. For the host, this was uncharted territory. He had built his career on controlling conversations, setting the tone, and ensuring that his guests played along with his humor. But this time, he had been the one on the receiving end of a perfectly timed quip, and the balance of power had shifted before he even had the chance to react. Even as he tried to move past it, the world wouldn't let him. The audience had witnessed something they hadn't seen in a long time, a genuine unscripted exchange where the guest took the lead and never looked back. And no matter how much the host tried to reclaim the moment, it was already out of his hands. But beyond the humor, beyond the viral nature of it all, there was something else at play. It was a reminder that in a world where entertainment is often overly polished, where moments are curated for maximum impact, and where spontaneity is becoming rarer, the best moments are the ones that can't be planned. And that's exactly what had happened. It wasn't a pre-written joke or a rehearsed punchline. It was a masterclass in quick thinking, in knowing when to strike and how to do it with style. It was the kind of exchange that people would talk about long after the episode had aired, not just because it was funny, but because it felt real. In the end, there was no need for further debate over who had won that night. The audience had already decided. The laughter, the online reactions, the endless replays of that single moment, it all spoke for itself. Some moments fade away, lost in the constant churn of entertainment. Others carve out a permanent place in pop culture history. And this? This was the kind of moment that people wouldn't forget.